it is time for us to get into the newsroom. And the question that we're asking this morning is whether you're satisfied with the kind of content on Kenyan media. And this, of course, is a conversation that we're going to be having right here in studio. But first, I'd also like to welcome you to join us in that conversation. You can do that via social media. And the hashtag is MorningExpressKTN. We'll also have the Twitter handles displayed as we carry on. Are you satisfied with the kind of content on Kenyan media? That's a question that we have this morning. And I'll introduce my guests this morning. And I'll start with my extreme left, where we have Jane Gaudier, who's gender and media communication consultant. Good morning, and thank you for joining us. We also have Dr. Buka, who is a lecturer and in media and communication. Good morning, and thank you for joining us. We have Koi Kariuki, audience research manager at Ipsos. And last but not least, we have Mr. Daniel Juma, who's Executive Director for Global Peace Foundation Kenya. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. And let me start, first of all, by saying it is good to have a panel that has more ladies than men. We're normally accused of having too many men, but there you go, which is a good thing. But content is what we want to discuss, and especially content on what we call mainstream media. And let me start with you, Koi. We recently had the shutdown, the media shutdown that we had on 4 main stations, and the general feel that we got from the response we got is that people did not miss, the media per se. But you have the statistics. Is that what we got? Was that a true reflection generally that people did not miss media, or was that just because it was response that we're getting from an urban setting?
I mean, I guess most of us work in an urban setting, so we know what we were doing during that time, during the shutdown. But we're also aware that in the rural areas where we've seen a real growth of television viewership, where there's a reliance on vernacular television and also obviously the mainstream stations that did go off. There was sort of not a distrust, but almost a shock as to why did this happen to us? Why are we not being able to see the content that we're used to seeing, that we're relying on to get our source of information? Within the urban areas, what we've seen, and I think some of the conversations that have been had, are that there was an increase in online viewership of some of the mainstream stations, which we did see. We tracked some of that. We've seen some new viewership. But the fact that we saw an overall decline in media consumption during that time is quite indicative of the relationship the public has with the media. Is it one of something that's sort of apathetic?
Okay, and that increase in online participation when we were shut down, would that be good evidence to say that people do rely on mainstream media? So when it was shut off, they had to look for another source?
True, but when we look at the data, one of the things that we do find is obviously social media is a huge vehicle for news. And when we look at the data, we see that Facebook and WhatsApp have even higher ratings than some of our mainstream stations. So yes, it is, the mainstream stations are our source of news, but the vehicles through which, and we know this, that we get in most of our up-to-date news is really social media.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
I'll come back maybe to the internet penetration, because those figures are, the use of things like social media is mainly for those who have the access to internet and all that. But generally, we don't know about others who may not. But I'll come back to that. Let me come to you, Jane Gaudier, and your general thoughts on the content that we air and whether we are actually addressing or airing content that people can connect with.
I think the Kenyan media is more of political, the mainstream. And with mainstream, I'm looking at television and maybe the major dailies like The Nation and The Standard and The People Daily. But when you go to radio, which is part of mainstream, and particularly where we have vernacular radio and maybe the Swahili radio like Radio Maisha, Radio Jambo, the content they are airing are what people want to hear and not political. It's about husband and a wife being reconciled, they had a quarrel. And you find that those are some of the things that people want to talk about. For me, personally, I think the mainstream media has, if mainstream in quotes, KTN, Nation, and K24,
Citizen.
you have tended to concentrate more, even on that content, it's about the men who are speaking. The women's voices are totally lacking. There's just a big gap that the media tends to think that if a man has not spoken, then it's not important. It's not an issue. Because they believe maybe women don't have opinions. I don't know. But for me, I think that's...
today at least I have women here, so I'm at least absolved from that. Yeah. Dr. Booker, before we get into the gender aspect of it, just generally the content that we have. We've been accused of mainly having political stuff. And that's why I guess for those who are responding, and it's not all of them, I'm sure, who responded, those who are responding to our question after the shutdown was that, no, actually, we didn't miss you. Trying to indicate that maybe when it comes to political stuff, there's too much of it. Do you agree that maybe it's too much? And what sort of content should we be targeting? Maybe I'll also come to Koi on that, but your thoughts on that?
Thank you. I think a good place to start would be to appreciate the fact that there's been disruption that has been brought about by technology. And the shutdown happened in a context where, you know, a number of people have access to alternative sources of news and information. So that in itself could have, you know, driven a number of audiences or media users onto the online platforms to access information. So let's not look at the shutdown in isolation, but let's look at it in the context of what's happening in terms of disruption. Even without the shutdown, are people still going to the legacy media actively, as we have always known them to do? The shutdown could have just provided, you know, a topic of discussion, and that then, you know, made the shift a lot more clearer. But over the years, I think what we've been experiencing is that, you know, that audience has been moving to the online platforms and the social media sites to be able to access information. Within the context of Kenya, for the longest time, the legacy media as we've known it has been the trusted institution. When institutions are rated, media has been one of those institutions that is highly trusted. But we lost the ball at some point. And a number of this goes back to, you know, how the coverage around the events of last year and, you know, people feeling that there was information that we were not providing from either sides of the political divide, that there was a lot of muzzling of the press, and, you know, that the content was not, you know, some of it was paid and sponsored, you know, so all those have implications on where people go for news and information. And that in itself, therefore, then prompted some of the responses that you were seeing, so much so that, you know, that trust was lost. But on a typical day, by the time we get home in the evening, for example, you're not sitting down in front of your television set to find what was the breaking story.
Waiting to know what happened.
No, right. You already know that. It's either through Facebook or your WhatsApp or other social, you know, media platforms.
Okay. Daniel, your thoughts on the content that we have so far?
I think it's a delicate balance that you know, the media has to apply in terms of content. You know, between like what the people need, what the people are interested in, and as you know very well, we are a very political country, and usually.
Are we really a political country, or is it what is aired that makes us feel like we are?
I think so. I think mostly because that is what that's what is really largely focused on, and so we think that if there is no politics in news, then there is no news at all. Yeah. So. Yeah, for me, I think you know, the role of the media, you know, is to inform objectively and truthfully. So, and it is the media's responsibility to be able to give the people, you know, the news that can help them, you know, to make decisions for their lives. So, I think it's a delicate, you know, balance. And as we do this, I think we must continue. The media must continue to fight for its space. And talking about the media shutdown that we had, I think that was very unfortunate. We do not want, you know, to be in a situation again whereby, you know, the media is shut down or regulated by government. You know, you can see what's happening, for example, in the U.S., where we have President Trump. You know, he is against the legacy media. He's against, and he talks against CNN. He doesn't like it. But that doesn't mean that CNN should stop doing what they have to do just to please the president. You know, so this is a delicate balance. So you must find that balance. And sometimes you must know that you are the voice of the voiceless, the voice of the people. If you abdicate that role as the voice of the people, then we cannot have a balanced society.
All right. Yeah. Koyi, I'll come to you on generally what, from your experience, Kenyans would want to watch, because maybe we're putting out content there that we think is what Kenyans would like to watch, and maybe it's different. But let's listen into what Kenyans had to say. We asked and posed the question as to what their preference for content is. Let's just listen in.
TV zinachangia sana kutujulisha maisha vile yanaendelea. Na leo kama sio TV hizi, sisi tulikuwa kwa giza kubwa sana. Especially sisi wa Kenya. Sisi wa Kenya unajua tunategemea TV kwa mambo yetu yote.
The way that we do see the media giving us information, you know, like us, we have come from the past regimes and we know how it was. So there is an improvement. Even if it is not all, there are some improvements. And we like that, yeah? Because we must always move with the times, yeah? Yeah? And you see, sometimes there are, like the last regimes, there were some times when we could not even know what is happening. But now, we do understand everything.
Mi niko satisfied, as in, hawaletangi habari ovyo mpaka wanaenda mashinani, wanaangalia, wanapata report huko, and then they compile that report as per what they have heard, maybe they have inquired from the people. So I think whatever they have gotten from the people, ndio wanapublish ama ndio wanaongea, na I think it is always true.
Sometimes I satisfied what I've seen in the media, but other times I am zingine zinaniletea naona it's not fair. Yes. Like other media houses, these local medias, sometimes when you check, when you view the body of a person who is dead, you view all of it, and that one is wrong.
All right, so generally that's what they had to say. So Koyi, we are accused of having a lot of political stuff. From your analysis, are Kenyans interested in politics? Are we that political?
Well, news is important to Kenyans. I mean, when we look at some of the top programs that have been watched by looking at the ratings, and not just in the recent past, but over the past 5, 6, 7 years, news, specifically Swahili news, is what Kenyans tend to watch the most. And it's probably when they're getting home, this is what they put on. They put on their stations that they trust or that they're aware of, and then they let it run probably until after the 9 o'clock news. So that's when we tend to have our peaks and troughs. But when we've looked at vernacular television stations coming up, we've seen a draw for the content, not just at the news peak, 7 and 9 p.m., but also during that 8 to 9 p.m. period, when we tend to see a dip for the mainstream stations. So yes, we are a country that does like news, but when it comes to vernacular content, and even we see it in radio, there's a higher affinity and connection. Sorry,
I understand there's a challenge there with the sound. I'll come back to you. Let me hear from you, Dr. Booker, from the university perspective, and as you're lecturing, is journalism reduced to just news gathering? And when we talk about news is not just politics. There's plenty of news that's happening away even from just the political scene. But how are we packaging that, and how can we do that differently?
I think a number of changes have been necessitated by the disruption that I talk about. So that even where people have access to breaking news on social media, they can still go back to the legacy media, the television stations and the newspapers, to be able to find a lot more information around the stories. So one of the things that is changing is the different approaches to journalism. Narrative journalism is, storytelling, where you tell stories. You go a lot more in-depth, you spend a lot more time on the story, you investigate. The challenge, however, is that for you to have that type of journalism, there is need for investment in it. that media houses have to be able to invest the resources and also invest in the quality of journalists that they are employing. When you look across, we've seen, over the last year, we've seen some of the seasoned names are leaving newsrooms, maybe because they are too expensive for media houses to sustain, or media houses haven't thought about ways of supporting the investigative reporting and the in-depth reporting that is necessary. And that needs to change. Part of the change would be in looking at what are the business models that are driving media businesses. I think for the longest time we have stuck to the old model where we aggregate audiences and then we take those audiences to advertisers and say, hey, at this time, yeah, we have these people who are watching. But that has totally changed. So what are the new business models that then can be able to support, that kind of journalism that goes a lot more in-depth, that does a lot more investigation. When you look at papers like the New York Times, they went through this phase where they sent home a number of journalists. But what has been happening over the years is they're bringing back a number of journalists who can tell good stories, who can go in-depth, who can investigate, because when all is said and done, when I get all the updates on my WhatsApp and there is a good story around even politics, then I'm likely to spend more time, going through that story, whether it's online or on the traditional platforms.
All right. Godia, do you think that mainstream media, and when I say mainstream media, maybe we need to define, because maybe that changes with time, but we're talking about, of course, the main TV stations that we have and possibly the newspapers and dailies. Do you think we still remain trusted? Because news is changing by virtue of the fact that there's social media. It's no longer news, it's no longer breaking news when you're watching TV. It's probably broken on Twitter or Instagram or whatever other platform there is. But do we remain the trusted source for verifying that information?
The mainstream media could remain trusted on the basis of the name and the brand. And people have access, easy access to TV and newspapers. And mainly that is just for urban people, because when you go down to the ground, when you go down to the rural areas, when you go down to the slums, people are listening to radio more. So maybe then the trust issue is, do you tell the truth? Are you objective? Do you cover? Do you refuse to let out some things? Do you censor? This issue of censorship. You censor because of the owner. You censor because of the advertiser. You censor because of your own security. So whatever you're bringing out and what Nancy is saying about in-depth analysis, investigative, we no longer have those interesting investigative stories that people would call you and say, KTN, can you please repeat? Those kind of stories that you're being asked, we watched, but by public demand, we are repeating them because people loved what they saw and they would still want to see again. That is no longer happening because the issue of even security for the journalist makes them now decide, I'm not going to tell this as it is. And for
put my life at risk.
To put my life at risk. And for me, at times I go out to the field, I meet a lot of journalists, and they tell you, oh, this happened, and then we decided. As a group of journalists in our area, they decide that we have decided that this one is not going to appear anywhere. Because they are protecting certain interests.
Okay.
And at the same time, now people with phones, you here, you are protecting certain interests, but me, Jane, with my phone, I've already taken this event, posted it. What we are picking from WhatsApp, it's not even online. What people have been shown on WhatsApp, WhatsApp has now become like another stream. I don't know whether it's mainstream or low stream, but it's another place where we are now receiving a lot of information coming in that then I would not see on KTN and I would not see on NTV or I would not see on any
Okay, and the good thing
space.
is that we have Koi here from Ipsos who's going to give us figures and generally not just guessing, because those are questions that we must ask ourselves, how that is also changing the content that we should have. Because like you mentioned, we as a main media house might choose to censor for whatever reason, but WhatsApp will not censor. Even like the lady who spoke there, and sometimes you'll find even bodies strewn all over, which is something that we may not want to show just because of the code of ethics and all that, but on other media platforms, they may not censor. So we're going to take a short break, but do stay with us. We'd also be looking at your comments and whether you feel that the content that we have on our mainstream media is content that you're satisfied with. For now, we take a short break, but we'll be right back with the newsroom.
This is